Hey everyone, Patrick McGee from the Financial Times in San Francisco. I'm going to probably spend like an entire 2 minutes just bigging up JB. Got to meet him first last year. He's this ridiculously humble guy, which is hilarious because he's done all kinds of achievements. And because he's not going to tell you about them, the humble thing, I'll just tell you a little bit about it. So in case you somehow don't know, JB is one of the co-founders of Tesla. He's literally the guy who, over a lunch, convinced Elon Musk that electric vehicles had a future. Daniel Yergin once called that the lunch that changed the world. It certainly changed probably the way everyone perceives electric cars in this room. When he stepped down, I think that was early 2019, Musk said without that lunch, Tesla basically wouldn't exist, or wouldn't exist, basically. And he was chief technology officer for his entire tenure there. Or I guess you got upgraded, but nevertheless, for all the years that we've known Tesla, he was CTO and played instrumental roles, like really quite visionary roles. I mean, JB's really known as the guy who had like battery breakthroughs, like the reason why lithium-ion batteries don't really catch on fire anymore, JB. The reason why they have the range they do, JB. The reason that they accelerate in ludicrous mode, JB. And then he also played huge roles in conceiving the Gigafactory, conceiving the supercharger network, and there's a third one I wanted to mention. Oh, the Semi, which, okay, hasn't been in production yet, but I understand that was your idea as well. So, you know, he's not just the powertrain engineer. He was like this instrumental visionary at Tesla. Doesn't always get the credit for it, so I thought I'd go on a slight rant. JB Straubel, everyone. Okay, so in my rant, I didn't even mention why you're here, which is to talk about the startup that you're CEO of. You raised $775 million last year. I mean, Amazon's an investor. I think T. Rowe Price, like basically, it's a who's who of investors in Silicon Valley. And you've managed to pick up all of them. I guess the track record, is basically able to extract a lot of attention. Let's talk about just the vision of Redwood Materials, why you founded it, how you founded it, right? Because it was founded before you left Tesla, sort of as a unit of Tesla or an idea that they had, and then you sort of went full bore into it. So it's based just outside of Carson City in Nevada, and what are you trying to do?
Well, great to be here. Thank you for the kind words. Tesla was a huge team activity, obviously, so just want to put that in context, all those things you said.
Humble, isn't that what I said?
But Redwood Materials, I started that in 2017, and it was a little bit before I stepped away formally from Tesla, but I felt it was just a really important, inspiring problem that I wanted to find a way to start to think about and build a team around. And what we're doing, in a nutshell, is building a closed-loop, sustainable ecosystem for batteries and battery materials. And at Tesla, I was pretty lucky to have a front-row seat to some of the problems that I think are now beginning to hit the whole industry, pretty much head-on, related to supply chain and particularly around batteries. And I really felt strongly that was going to become a bottleneck to the whole industry. So that's, in a nutshell, again, why I wanted to focus on that problem.
So the reason why I love Redwood's mission, obviously there's a lot of proof points to actually execute it, but in terms of the idea that you're trying to tackle is that the problem with electric vehicles is the actual mining to get the materials that are needed it's sort of like if you look at the photos coming out of China or, of course, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, like it's awful. So the more we can actually use and reuse those materials, then, the less of a role that's playing sort of per, whatever, ton of metal, or however one would want to go after it. So could you just describe like the problem of the status quo and what your vision is for what things might be in 10 years?
Well, I'd say there's maybe 2 or 3 critical problems with the status quo. One is just access to enough materials quickly enough, and can we ramp up that entire supply chain to not be a limiter on how fast we want and need to transition to EVs. So just a physical ramp constraint on all the things related to battery supply chain. The second is the sustainability of it. As we just heard from Toyota and many others, the emissions needed to build a battery and to build an EV are meaningful. And that contributes to the total payback and the total emissions payback of operating an EV or a PHEV. And by having a higher recycled material content, more and more over time, that is, I believe, the best way to reduce the embedded emissions inside a battery and get to a faster emissions payback for any type of battery vehicle. So those are, I'd say 2 of the headaches and problems right now is just the need to ramp and also the sustainability of that supply chain as it exists today. And and how fast it can change.
I wanted to mention plugins later, but you just brought it up, so I might as well just skip to that now. Do you have much sort of faith in plug-in technology as a way to get to a green future?
You mean plug-in hybrids or
Yeah.
plug-in hybrids? I think it can play a part. I would think we should probably look at the analysis where you have a nearly zero carbon grid. And if you're charging EVs or PHEVs from zero carbon electricity, I believe the balance does shift and it really favors BEVs more. So I ultimately think we have to get to 100% BEV future. Maybe PEVs can be a part of the transition.
The reason why I ask is, and you'll know better than me, but I mean the battery materials needed for a plug-in are much, much less than what's needed for a full-on EV. And because of range anxiety and in a sense the way that cars have been promoted, everyone wants 500 miles range, right? And like most people don't actually need that except for maybe like, for my instance, the one time a year I drive from San Francisco to Vancouver. But otherwise, I don't need that. But I, like everyone else, feel like I should have that for that one trip. And that's sort of a problem, especially given the insights you have into battery shortages. I mean, if there's an overriding theme at the conference, I think it probably is the worry about battery materials having a massive shortage, right? I mean, we're talking about the chip shortage right now, but it really is going to be likely. You have an airplane analogy that I quite like, and then maybe you can go into some of the numbers or as to how you see it.
Well, I do think that's a meaningful concern for the whole industry. I mean, it took us 20 odd years to get to 5 to 10% market share for BEVs, and now we're looking ahead and thinking we're going to go from 10 to 90% or 10 to 50%. Choose your projection in the next 10 years or maybe 15 years. So the rate has to be an order of magnitude higher. That said, I'm still fairly optimistic that we can find a way to do this. That airplane analogy, though, that I've used is really kind of an overbooked flight. And it feels like we are in a case where all the automakers in the world, most of them, are now, I think, really getting focused on how can they transition to BEV product mixes. But they're all doing it at the same time. Everyone wants to go to the same island or the same future point at a very similar time, but we haven't built an infrastructure, we haven't built a supply chain to let everyone get there very quickly.
Right. So, and if we've built that supply chain, like globally, it's actually in Asia, right? So there's this big sort of contrast between, or not contrast, but on the one hand, America wants to have energy independence. On the other hand, it wants a green future. And at the moment, at least, until Redwood is really successful, right? Those two live in conflict. Can you speak about that a little bit?
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, most of the battery material supply chain is focused in Asia, whether it's Japan, Korea, or China. The raw materials are spread all over the planet, but they generally move to Asia to be processed into the battery materials or batteries themselves to be made into EVs. So that also is a pretty big challenge with this whole thing. It has an emissions footprint of moving the materials so many miles all around the planet to do that, and also an energy security problem with being very, very reliant on a single region for all these materials.
Some numbers JB gave me last year. Oh, and by the way, as always, I always forget to say that if you want to ask a question, I'm more than happy to you can address JB yourself. So if you're online, use the chat box and I'll get the questions. And if you're here, you can flag it to an FT person and they'll come over with a microphone. Shoot, I just gave myself the little preface. What was it that I was going to say? Now I really need one of you to stand up with a question. The stat that I used last year that you gave me, which I thought was brilliant, was that cobalt can often travel 20,000 miles from being in the ground to being in a car that then one puts a zero emission sticker on, which is just insane. So there is something just crazy about the status quo. And you just mentioned closed loop, I think, but if you could just spell that out a little bit. I mean, in my mind, the idea is that outside of Carson City, if you were working with Tesla in Fremont, you're really going to close that loop between just like, the car's end of life happens in Fremont, goes back to Carson City, travels back after you've like sort of pulverized it and reproduced it. But just give that, but without my sort of, flippant disregard for details.
Well, it is very true. The materials inside of a battery, have a massive amount of movement before they actually, land in that car. It's true with many components, I think, in today's supply chain, but batteries are particularly challenging right now because the supply chain is not really optimized for the scale that it needs to run at, and it's quite far-flung. So closed loop, I think that sometimes gets to be misused or overused even these days a little bit, but the simple concept is just basically, keeping those materials in a remanufacturing loop. It's really nothing more than a very deep and a very, chemically oriented remanufacturing that has to happen. And batteries are very unique and not very intuitive in the fact that they don't consume any of the materials they're made out of. It's totally different than a fossil fuel-based ecosystem where you have a lot of petroleum that moves in and through a car and then it's chemically converted and it's gone. You can't remanufacture that without more energy than it took the first time through. Batteries are different. You put metals into them, the metals stay in there for their entire life. They get changed a little bit, corroded, degraded, but the metals are all still contained. They didn't go anywhere. So it opens the door to have this concept of a closed loop manufacturing ecosystem around batteries and EVs that can have extremely high recoveries, 95, 98, 99% recovery of all those critical elements that we all worry so much about each time through that loop. So I'm confident this is what the future will be. You know, whether it's 50 years or 100 years in the future, we're going to be sitting here with a global ecosystem of mostly BEVs and mostly remanufactured batteries, you know, going through this remanufacture, recycling, if you want to call it that loop, and not needing to mine very much material to augment that.
Now, when we first spoke a year ago or so, the discussion was thoroughly just about this topic, and yet Redwood is ridiculously ambitious, like on the scale that Tesla is. And so you've also sort of expanded the business into sort of 2 more areas. Do you want to discuss those?
Sure. Well, and maybe just to comment on the ambition, you know, it's not just ambition for ambition's sake. You know, the problem is incredible facing all of us, and you know, the need to figure out how we get to zero emissions by 2050 or 2040 or sooner, it's truly daunting. And you know, it's going to take, you know, ambition from every single company out there, even, you know, tangentially related to this space, more so than I think everyone imagines is possible. So to me, I feel this like personal sense of almost urgency and panic that we have to go faster than it even seems possible. And part of our ambition, to come back to your question, is really creating more of that closed loop ecosystem. If you just do battery recycling and, you know, shred up a battery and create some kind of black mass material, you haven't really solved the loop. You haven't made a material that's useful to really anyone yet, other than maybe a nickel or a cobalt refinery. So our aim is to really, you know, do the entire piece that's missing. You know, figure out how we go from old devices, scrap products, manufacturing waste, all the way back through into materials that can come straight into cell manufacturing and displace, you know, other materials, new materials, and do it locally. So not rely on, you know, leveraging or riding on the back of the industry that already exists in Asia somewhere. So that necessitates us to make cathode material, to make anode copper foils, and other battery components that are not very sexy. Most people don't even really think about cathode manufacturing, but it is actually the single most expensive component in a BEV. So, you know, these are
And as I understand it, I mean, there's basically zero cathode production in the US.
There is almost zero. There are a few people doing it at small scale, but compared to where the industry is going and even is today, it's functionally zero.
Right. So beyond recycling, you want to be doing cathode. Is the term refinery for cathode and anode refinery?
Manufacture. It's really manufacturing. This is chemical and material manufacturing.
And that's 65% of the materials in the battery, the cost of a battery?
Roughly, yeah. Between all the copper-containing materials and foils and the cathode itself, it's about 65% of the cost structure of a lithium-ion cell.
Okay, a couple questions are coming in from the audience, so I'll just read them. Are changes in ownership models a prerequisite to obtaining a supply of end-of-life batteries to establish a truly closed loop?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think the current ownership structures, whether it's lease, ownership, you know, anything in between, I think that can still work just fine. And the key is, you know, figuring out how we have efficient reverse logistics and, you know, making sure those batteries have a very, you know, again, efficient, both economically and emissions way to get back into a remanufacturing loop. The volumes are still quite low right now from an EV point of view. So, you know, this is really nascent. It's almost too early. But on the other hand, if you look at, you know, the volumes of EVs we need to have on the roads in 5 or 10 years from now, I feel like we're too late starting to build the infrastructure at scale to do this.
This person says, will preparing for recycling these critical elements reduce the need for mining? I mean, that's largely the whole point. But then they say, by how much?
Well, the challenge, though, is we can't recycle our way to an EV fleet. You know, the math doesn't functionally work. You know, you have to recycle something that exists already. So a lot of new mining is absolutely still needed. I definitely don't want to, you know, stand here and say we We don't need more mining. We will have to convert the billion plus cars on the planet today, assuming we keep something that near that many, into something sustainable. So that requires new materials. However, in a steady state, after this is all matured, we won't need to mine very much. You would only need to mine for the fleet expansion or for the loss in that cycle as it's running. And lead acid batteries, I think, are a very, very obvious, in-our-face example of how this can work. Lead acid batteries today don't consume a whole lot of lead. There's a lot of materials that are moving in a recycling and remanufacturing loop, but they don't require a lot of new mining to make that type of product work.
You meet a lot of the likes of Jennifer Granholm, people that are involved in regulation, policymaking. And are you calling for more U.S. mining? Because there does seem to be this inherent contradiction in the EV movement that on the one hand, they're super pro-EV. On the other hand, they don't want any mining, sort of, the NIMBY mentality, basically, but all throughout America, which seems a bit insane. So what's your view on whether there should be a whole lot of U.S. mining?
I mean, I think there should be more responsible U.S. mining. And I think, the administration in the U.S., probably shares that point of view. But, of course, the devil's in the details of, what that is, where it is, and there's really no way to make progress and change on all these areas without some impact somewhere. And I think, the more pragmatic we can be about keeping the bigger vision in mind, the bigger goal in mind of decarbonizing industry and doing that in a thoughtful way, that really is how I believe those decisions should get made. And even recycling has some impact. It's an industrial activity. We need new facilities to be built. So there's no completely free lunch here. But I am definitely a proponent of expanding supply of these different materials. We have to do it, or we can't build more EVs.
Someone watching wants to know if this is going to be profitable.
Absolutely. Recycling is today still cheaper than mining. And even at this tiny scale, that relatively tiny scale, we're able to compete and sell materials back in at prices lower than mining. And if I might add also, that to me is a really exciting view of what can happen as recycled material content goes higher and higher every single year that goes by. It offers a pathway to get to a future industry that can really reduce the functional material cost in batteries, which is, again, one of the biggest headaches of how do we keep prices coming down, how do we meet customer expectations of a $50 per kilowatt hour battery pack. You really can't do that very easily with today's prices for nickel and lithium, or let alone copper, cobalt, et cetera. However, if those materials are able to be used many, many times, if they're effectively amortized over the life of multiple batteries or cars, you can imagine getting to a much lower cost structure for those batteries.
I'm realizing I'm asking a lot about ambitions, dreams, vision of a closed loop, et cetera, but this isn't just sort of willy-nilly. You're already working with quite a lot of materials. You have some major partners. I know Panasonic's a partner, which obviously sort of does half the Gigafactory. Who else is in there? Ford,
Panasonic,
Amazon's an investor. Who are the other investors providing you scrap, providing you material?
Well, today we recycle about 6 gigawatt hours per year of energy storage in various forms and shapes and sizes. It's a big number when you look at the number of semi-trucks of material that it takes to move that type of volume. But again, on the scale of what's needed in the years to come, it feels small. We're the largest material recycler in the U.S. today, and aiming to be the largest battery materials manufacturer in the near future, both of this anode copper foil and also the cathode materials. But it takes a long time to build these things.
Yeah, you've told me when I've asked for where are you in Tesla terms, remind me what your answer was.
It feels like we're in kind of the early Model S days, I would say.
Right.
We're really demonstrating the technology is somewhat mature. We know this works, but we're really working on scaling it and proving that we can operate these at much larger scales.
Where does Redwood stand on hydrogen as fuel? I think that probably means where do you stand on hydrogen as fuel, right? I'm not sure Redwood has a company view.
Redwood doesn't have much involvement in hydrogen to speak of. Personally, I'm a bit pessimistic on hydrogen. I think, first of all, we have to focus on green hydrogen. If we're going to focus on hydrogen at all, it needs to be made from sustainable sources, I think, or it doesn't make much sense. And when you do that, I believe you really do have a cost challenge, a delivered cost challenge into whatever vehicle or machinery is using that hydrogen. So if I look at the trajectory of battery costs and energy density improvements versus the trajectory of hydrogen, I don't see an obvious point where hydrogen somehow turns a corner and gains a big market share.
Right. How energy intensive are Redwood's recycling processes?
Well, it does take energy, to drive any of these processes forward, but we've gone through some pretty elaborate and detailed studies on that relative to the processing of ore and refining of that and mining it. So to me, the benchmark is we need to be better than mining. If we're worse than mining, that doesn't really make a lot of sense to do it. But we are much, much better than the energetics of mining. And part of that is because the materials are already so concentrated and refined in a battery pack. We're starting with something that has, maybe 50 times more concentration of these, elements like nickel, lithium, cobalt than the ores do that people need to mine.
I love this point. So yeah, if you're mining for lithium, it's a very tiny percentage of the rock that you're mining that's actually lithium.
Very small.
In the battery.
You're generally talking about parts per million in brine, or maybe single-digit percents in hard
Right.
rock. So you need to move massive amounts of rock around and crush it, pulverize it, leach it, do these different operations to it. It's hard to do that incredibly energy efficiently.
And those other parts per million are basically useless, right? Whereas in a battery, it's cobalt, it's magnesium, it's other metals that you can.
It's generally true, yeah. There's a lot of other usable materials mixed in. So the energetics of recycling are far better. That's part of why the emissions profile of recycling and remanufacturing from previous products is also much, much better. But we're doing all the remanufacturing we do with sustainable energy. That's one key point. We've minimized or eliminated fossil fuel use in all of the different processes. So even the processes that use some thermal energy, we tend to focus on those being what's called autothermal or self-powered based on the residual energy in the products.
What's the biggest threat that would cause you to not be able to achieve your ambitions?
Well, I think we are pretty ambitious in how fast we can grow, and I think there are some pretty difficult problems in building this whole industry and ecosystem in parts of the world where it's never operated before. Just like many auto OEMs who are trying to transition to EVs, there isn't the talent base. There's maybe not an industrial group of people who are familiar with making things like cathode material or precision copper foil in the U.S. or in Europe. So, to me, it's a question of speed. And can we achieve these ambitions fast enough? That I'd say it's the bottleneck around people and training and resources there that is probably one of our bigger risks.
I just got final confirmation that Elon will be with us in 17 minutes. You have no idea how palpable the relief is. As and when charging gets really good, how much smaller might batteries get?
Well, I think it's really maybe more related to energy density of batteries, perhaps, than charging. Is that sort of the question, or?
Yeah. Well, I think you're framing the answer better than the question.
I think batteries still have a lot of room for improvement. They may be 2 to 3 times as energy dense as they are today. And if you look at some of the most cutting edge battery designs that I've seen, still in sort of prototype or lab form, that's achievable. It's not commercialized today at price and whatnot, but if you had a battery that's 2 or 3 times as good as today's batteries in a car, it's completely game over for gasoline. It's sort of strange to even be having a discussion about it. And then also, I think you can start to have a little bit less of a debate about the 300 or 400 or 500 mile battery, because ultimately, I really believe you need something more than 300 miles to make a car that's fully usable and meets everyone's expectations. We just need to do that with a very efficient amount of materials and a smaller size battery.
Okay, final 30 seconds. I want to talk about expansion plans just real quick. So first, just remind me the facility you have being produced right now to build the cathode, the foil material, and such. When is that going online? And then when are you hoping that you might do the same thing in Europe?
Well, we're constructing and building that facility right now in the U.S. So we're starting our copper foil manufacturing late this year. Panasonic is actually our first customer for that material. And that's truly a closed loop. It's really a cool example of basically moving that material not more than maybe 15 or 20 kilometers from production scrap through to remanufacturing back to factory. That's starting late this year. The cathode materials start in late 2024 and ramp for us in the US into 2025. Again, I wish we could go faster. The demand is very large. All that material is being sent on ships, all the way halfway across the planet. And many people don't even have the supply chain fully assured yet for how they will do this. In Europe, we're aiming to start that about a year and a half later. So our goal is to really refine and replicate the same model and the scaling model that we're doing in North America and do that in Europe to follow.
Great. All right. Huge thanks to JB Straubel, who flew out from Nevada just for this conference and is going back, I think, tomorrow morning, right? It's a little bit insane. So huge thanks. I'm going to invite my colleague, Joe Miller, he's just over there, for a final panel. And then JB's coming back on stage with Elon Musk, and we're going to have a quick discussion about the early days at Tesla.
Thank you.
Cheers.